Well, guys, it's an honor to have been invited to come over here and visit with y'all. I really appreciate the opportunity to do it. And I'll give you a little bit of background on me. So I'm from Mississippi. I don't know if you can tell by the accent. Born and raised there on a cotton, corn, soybean farm. My dad is 82 years old. My brother farms that operation now, and I was a little brother that went on to school and stayed in school a really long time and found an opportunity to work in production agriculture. And so for the last 12 years, I have been the extension soybean specialist for Mississippi. And, just to tell you a little bit more about, our production systems and then kind of get into some of the experiences that we've had. So, if I was to look back over the last 25 years of history, I can remember when I was a kid, we would grow group 6s and 7s sometimes, late group 5s in Mississippi. So what's really changed for us is we've gone to earlier varieties. I heard somebody use the term early varieties early in the presentation. So we grow a lot of group 4s now in Mississippi, mainly group 4s. Probably 85% of our total acres are group 4s. The rest of it would be early to mid group 5. So that's different than what it was 25 years ago. As a result, our interest and our success in soybean production has increased. So our yields have gone up. The level of management that we put into our crop has gone up, and just we've turned the crop from what we would typically plant on those other acres that wasn't in cotton to something that most of our guys choose year in, year out to grow. So where we are now as a state, we typically are in that 2.1 to 2.3 million acre range. And just to give you some perspective, our cotton is usually 500,000 to 600,000 or 700,000 acres now, and our corn maybe 600,000 to 800,000 acres as a state. So those are our big three. Of course, we have some rice and some other things too, a few acres of peanuts and things like that. So desiccation of soybeans, if we look at it, how many of you guys do desiccate? Let me get that in my head here. Just a few of you. Okay, all right. So I remember I farmed a little while myself while I was in school to kind of help put myself through school. I remember spraying a harvest aid on some beans one time, and the goal of it was simply just to knock the weeds out. I had a bunch of morning glory vines growing in it, and we were trying to get those vines out to make the machine go through there better, right? So I think that was our goal historically. When you look at when people talk about using a desiccant in soybeans, it was just simply to get the weeds out and make it where you could harvest it better. So you fast forward to the last 10 years, and where we are now in the Mid-South, we're using it on probably 70% of our acres now, and it has nothing to do with the weeds. We're doing it to kill the crop and facilitate a faster harvest. So, when you look at late season harvest issues, you guys are pretty close to an ocean. Y'all know what I'm talking about when you have weather come in. Hurricanes are stinking up terrible when it comes to soybeans. Damage, y'all get a lot of damage, quality issues. We're going to talk about some of that in here too. So that's one of the things. So anything that we can do to try to mitigate that, simply is to speed it up, to get it out. My favorite comment that I've heard from a producer, so let me back up and say this. If you asked me if I thought we needed to desiccate every single acre, absolutely not. These soybeans will senesce on their own sometimes. And if you had to do every acre, we do not have to do every acre. My favorite comment that I've ever heard a farmer say, though, is he will do every acre because the efficiency at which his machine will move through that field is night and day difference when he sprays them and doesn't spray them. All right, and that may have a lot to do with our environment and the maturities that we're growing in Mississippi. And again, so I just really wanted to use today as an opportunity to share our experiences with you and hope that you guys can glean some information with it. I've got green stem in there. I'm gonna make a comment about that here in just a second. So stand establishment and harvest implications. So what we see most often, I mentioned the weeds, we're sure we get some late season emerging weeds at times that can be problematic, but most of it is greenness, right? And so what we have found in our earlier production varieties and our earlier planting dates, early systems, we get a lot of variability in that field. All right, so here's a picture. This is a common April planted soybean problem in Mississippi. We will plant, it will be cool and wet, it will rain 3 inches instead of 3/10 of an inch, and everything will go underwater for a brief period of time, and then we'll get a thin stand of beans or a delayed stand. I have seen soybeans come up over weeks. Literally, the same planting date, I have seen some emerge 4 weeks later from that ground. How that seed survived, I have no idea, but it has done it. So what does that look like at the end of the season? You got some maturing variability out there. You have plants in the row that are mature, other plants that still have some green to it, and it can kind of create a mess when you're getting ready to put your combine in the field. So harvest aids, I don't have the whole comprehensive list of everything that has a label. All right, so even glyphosate has a label as a harvest aid. The things that I put up here are the things that we use or have access to that actually has activity on the plant itself. So again, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to terminate that plant and get it knocked out. So paraquat, sharpen, sodium chlorate. So sodium chlorate's been around forever. Paraquat's been around forever. Sharpen, it's been less than 10 years, I know. Probably maybe 8 or 10 years ago, it got a label for use as a harvest aid in soybeans. So here's the rate ranges of these different products. Paraquat, depending on which formulation you're using. Most of what we do is at 1/4 pound AI. So, if that was a 2 pound material, I think that comes out to a pint. Sharpen, 1 to 2 fluid ounces. I've done a lot of research. I'm going to share some of these data slides with you too. In my research, the 1 ounce rate isn't enough. 1.5 ounces sometimes is enough. Most of the time is enough. 2 would probably be better, but at least 1.5 ounces of sharpen, and then sodium chlorate, 3 to 6 pounds. And I put that caveat in there because sometimes we might use it by itself. If you use it by itself, 6 pounds, that's the rate. Sometimes we tank mix it with paraquat. And the reason we do that is to knock out any extra greenness that might be out there. So remember, paraquat's a herbicide, sharpen's a herbicide. Sodium chlorate's actually a desiccant. So its entire job in life is to withdraw moisture from whatever it contacts. So if we have a lot of green stems or green seed out there in the field, sometimes we'll tank mix that 3 pound rate of chlorate with paraquat, and that will help kind of dry some of this stuff out. So looking at this is just a standard structure of how I would set up and have set up a lot of the research trials that we've done over the years, looking at these things by themselves at these rates and in a combination. And of course, each product has its own label recommendations for adjuvants. The adjuvants are key to making sure that you get the performance out of these that you want to get. So whenever I set up a harvest aid, or desiccant, however you want to term the practice, whenever I set up an experiment, I evaluate these things 3 days after application, a week after. I usually do it again at 14 or 15 days after the application. And the main reason I do that is just to cover all the pre-harvest intervals that are associated with each of these products. So the bottom line is that when you look at the performance of these things, first and foremost, it depends on how much green is out there. The more green it is, the longer it's going to take any of these to do what they're supposed to do. The less green that's out there, it might look like it's ready in about 3 days, depending on which product you did. So this particular data set, this application would have gone out right at R7. So, the plant would be ready to start senescing, not quite to senescence, but ready to start senescing by itself anyway. So we were just trying to speed it up, okay? So 3 days after application, we got pretty good activity out of paraquat, and then the tank mixes up. But the bottom line is it really takes about a week. So in that kind of situation to get to where you want to be, regardless of the product. So I don't know how well these pictures are going to show up in the back of the room, but if you look real close, you can see green stems. You see all the leaves on the ground. A lot of that desiccated and fell right off, but you see a lot of the greenness still on the row. So that's paraquat. There's the partnership between paraquat and sharpen. And here's the paraquat and sodium chlorate. Again, you just see the trend through there that 3 and 7 days, some of the greenness in the stems is still there at 3, but it's kind of gone at 7. Sharpen by itself. Yield, as far as yield goes with these harvest aids, I have never seen a yield difference between products. The yield difference comes between treated and untreated depending on application timing. So bottom line is we can kill the bean too early, right? So if we kill it too early, we're going to have a yield loss. Paraquat is obviously the fastest, and I'll just be honest with you, it's our dominant choice. When we use it, most of our growers will use paraquat. A lot of them will tank mix sodium chlorate with it, again, depending on the situation. But it's going to give you the fastest visual cue. And have y'all, I mean, I'm sure y'all cut green beans, smells like you just ran a lawnmower through the field, fresh cut grass back there. So we can do that, we can speed it up, but it's really going to take about a week before it gets to what it's supposed to be, at least in our part of the world, in terms of wanting to send that combine through the field and harvest it. So you're looking at pre-harvest intervals, you know, again, 7 days after application, paraquat and sharpen, you see those, everything had reached a harvestable state by then, but those sharpen and sodium chlorate would have been the only two that had actually reached its pre-harvest interval by that time. So the bottom line is these products are all effective. They all do a good job. There's different baggage that comes along in our part of the world with each one, and depending on how you want to do it. Do y'all do most things by ground, applications by ground? No aerial applications? We're blessed to have a lot of ag pilots in part of our state, and a lot of this will actually go out by air. So you might want to choose product based on your application method, is what I'm getting at with that. So application, harvest days, typically we're going to see a week to 2 weeks advantage in early, getting it out ahead of just letting it naturally senesce by itself. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about timing in just a second, but there will be a yield loss if the seed's not fully developed in that field. So product selection based on multiple factors. So here's really the meat of it for me, expected weather conditions. So for example, if we've got a hurricane brewing in the Gulf of Mexico that's coming our way, I'm probably not going to spray sodium chlorate because it's a desiccant, and the data would suggest that there's a potential, not always, but a potential for excess shattering that might come when you use a desiccant product that dries that pod out. So if we have a hurricane coming, we don't know how long it's going to take before we can get back into that field, because we don't know really what the weather's going to do. I would avoid that desiccant product and just stick with the paraquat option to do it. Now, again, that would be timing, and we can talk more about timing in just a second. Cost, everything costs different. I think that's probably the main driver behind the paraquat being the most widely used product in our area. Status of neighboring fields, drift, off-target movement, depends on what you got. So for us, my best example would be rice. We have rice fields. Sharpen's not going to harm that rice the way that paraquat would, so some of our guys may utilize sharpen in some of those fields that neighbors against some of that rice. So timing. So when you look at the labels of these things, most of them will tell you to 65% mature pods, right? And there's a lot of, that to me is a moving target because it depends on some of that variability that we get in the field. Are most of y'all, what are y'all growing around here? Determinants or indeterminates? Indeterminates, okay, so this will fit good. So y'all are familiar with what indeterminate and determinate varieties are and how to ID those. So what I tell our guys to look for when we're getting ready to make this decision. So we do a lot of late season management termination decisions hinged around these growth stages. So R6, you can Google the R6 definition of a soybean, and most of the time it'll just tell you soybeans filling the pod. The textbook definition is soybeans filling the pod, somewhere in the upper 4 nodes. So there's a lot of confusion that I encounter from time to time. Sometimes people will open up a pod where the seed are touching and call that R6. Seed touching and seed full is not R6. And why does that matter? Well, if you terminate too early, you could stand to lose a little bit of yield potential. So R6 or seed completely filling that pod wall. You see that picture right there. What that is a pod cut in half. And you see that center seed. So if you got a 3 or 4 bean pod, that middle seed is going to be square at R6 because it's so fat and full, it's pushed up against its neighbor inside that pod wall. So that's the true definition of R6. So you fast forward about 10 to 15 days in our part of the world and you get to R6.5. Do y'all utilize the R6.5 growth stage? So we use it for termination of irrigation, insecticides, things of that nature, but also to prep for this. So R6.5, I tell our guys just to shell that pod open, turn it upside down. If that seed is turning loose of that protective membrane in that pod wall and falling out, it's done. It's really a green field still, but if it's turning loose of that pod wall and not connected anymore inside that pod, then that seed's finished and it's beginning its senescence process to dry down. So just again, I think the thing that that when we first started really spraying a lot of harvest aids, sometimes I think we would spray them a little bit too late, and the crop was already beginning to kind of dry like it was. And then now some we're spraying a little bit too early, to be quite honest with you. And we're trying to balance getting the machines through the acres, what we're dealing with at elevators, weather conditions, and things like that. But R6 soybeans are green, R6.5 soybeans are still pretty green too. So when we're talking about getting ready to spray a harvest aid, you know, we're going to have to get out of the truck and go out there in the field, shell open these pods and really look at them to ID when is appropriate time to do it, so that we can make sure we don't have any yield loss. So quality issues, you know, seed quality, grain quality, depending on what terminology you want to use. For us, most of what we deal with is sprouted or rotten seed. And I think that most years of my career, I've seen it somewhere. We've had a couple of favorable falls where we didn't get a lot of rainfall, and we were blessed not to have a whole lot of damage, but we've had some that were catastrophic as well. So what it is, we didn't have any in 2023, mainly because we had the worst drought we've had in about 20 years too. But when we look at what we're dealing with, we get these seeds that sprout, or the pods that'll come open, and we get some sprouting in there. And so what causes that? And in my opinion, I think that a lot of our varieties, the seed are so large that when you set that seed size, you got either the pod size, you got one set of environmental conditions going on, right? And so the pod size is set, and then we shift gears and that seed starts filling up that pod. Well, I think our seed are so big with a lot of these modern varieties that seed's simply outgrowing that pod wall. So when that happens, you're talking about, again, R6 soybean, right? It's fat and full inside that pod. So if that pod wall can't handle it, the seam is ruptured. When that seam gets ruptured, it rains after that, moisture just got in. So if you have an unfortunate rainfall event at a time where you have that pod wall that's been breached, you might end up with having some level of this. If we ever see any of this starting to pop up, now this picture was taken a little bit later in the cycle, but if we had some pretty green beans out there and we start seeing this, we're probably going to get ready to terminate that field just as soon as we possibly can to get the crop out so that we can minimize some of the loss to some of that damage that we're going to get. So whenever we have these years of poor quality and sprouting, these are the frequently asked questions list that I get. First one is, if I hadn't sprayed that harvest aid, would I still have this much damage? So y'all remember, we've gone from probably spraying 10-15% of our acres with a harvest aid as needed 10 or 15 years ago. We're spraying about 70% of our acres now to terminate them. So again, if I hadn't sprayed that harvest aid, would I still have all this damage? So that's a terribly difficult question to answer. And y'all know sometimes in this research world, there's been a lot of discussion this morning on research and taking that science and bringing it to the farm. So it's very difficult to recreate an environmental condition in the research world. So what I did, the only thing I knew to do was just to spread it out. So we're going to get rain most falls. So we designed an experiment for a former graduate student of mine where we had 2 planting dates. We planted some beans early in April and a later planting date in May. And we set up plots to have treated, so harvest aid treated beans and untreated beans in the same experiment, and we had built in these harvest delays. So we had a harvest delay of whenever they were ready, so that'd be my normal harvest here in this graph, 2, 4, and 6 weeks late. All right, so what that ended up being, we had beans that were ready to harvest in August, late August, early September for us, and that carried out. We had plots that stayed in these tests all the way to about Thanksgiving. So we had about a 2-month window to try to capture at these locations some of this bad weather that would come in and cause some of this damage. Well, that worked. So we were, not all locations had damage, but the locations that got excessive rainfall, we did have some damage that came in. So we were able to evaluate the question, if I hadn't sprayed that harvest aid, would I still have this much damage? Because again, we had treated and untreated plots. So what I can tell you is the only level of damage that we had came from the harvest delay. So we see this yield by harvest delay. We lost our yield from our normal. It's just a stair step down, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks late. Here's the damage part of that. Here's the total damage. So we took samples from all this. I took it to a third party, USDA designated grain grading facility. They graded the seed for us, and here's the damage numbers that came back. So really, not a lot. I mean, 10% damage is a lot of damage. Please don't misunderstand me. But, some years I've seen 40 and 50 and 100% in some cases. But over the purposes of this thing, see that early planted soybean, that 6-week delay, that's where we had a lot of that damage. So what happened? Those beans had a lot of rain on them just based on how it lined up. We had a certain planting date, a certain level of maturity, and whenever those beans went through and those pods were filling up and got full, we had ruptured pods. We got a lot of damage in there, so it was based back on the planting date. But the bottom line was the harvest date didn't cause it. So where we had sprayed and unsprayed beans, we had the same level of damage regardless of whether a harvest date had been applied. This next question I get is I can see a clear difference in damage between early planted soybean and later planted soybeans. So should we be planting later? So for us, the argument is most of the time it's our early planted beans that catch this, right? It's the April planted beans, and there's a region in our state where it just seems to be really more challenging. Anytime we are able to plant in that particular planting window, it's almost inevitable there's going to be some level of damage that comes in. So, again, I see a clear difference in damage between early and later planted beans. Should we manipulate that? This is just a planting date yield graph of some Mississippi generated data, so I'm not going to dive into that. The point is that for our part of the world, I could show you piles and piles and piles of planting date data, and it's all going to point back to an April planted soybean in the state of Mississippi sets you up for the highest yield potential. So just put that in your mind. Early planted equals highest yield potential. All right, so the last year that we had really substantial damage, as a state, widespread, was 2018. I just happened to have a planting date study in the field that year. So what we did, again, we kept some seed at harvest from the planting dates, had that graded out, took it to one of our ag economists, had the money for that year, so the selling price of soybeans for that calendar year, all that put in to create this table. So here you got your average yield. Early planted beans were 60 bushels, late planted were 51. We talked about the statistical separation there. That's a difference. We had a difference in yield. Early planted beans, greater yield. Here's the seed damage. We had 21% damage on average in those early planted beans, less than 5% on those late planted beans. Which one would you rather have if you were looking in your combine tank, just to take the elevator? 5, right? So when you put the dollar bill to it and you take these deductions, the net return above the treatment, we made more money with the greater yield, even with the greater damage. So my point is that do we manipulate our planting date to try to avoid damage? No. Stick with what we know. Go with the early planted soybean production system that has the opportunity to set up for the greatest yield potential. Last question I usually get is, should I change my variety intentions to something different to be able to avoid this level of damage? So that one's again, a moving target, because y'all know how fast our available varieties cycle through, and it's really difficult to evaluate all these varieties in this particular situation. So probably that same 2018 year, in all the on-farm variety demonstration trials that I've done, we started keeping seed from every single one of them. And we generated, we're trying to go with the long-term data set there to see, the varieties change from year to year, but we're trying to watch these trends to see if we see differences between those varieties from a genetic standpoint. And what I can tell you is that we don't have great levels of difference between genetics. There are some subtle differences. So in other words, variety A may weather better than variety B. But I think that when we do get these great levels of damage, it really impacts all the varieties. So you can't just pick one that seem to weather it better than others. And I think that just goes back to confirm, at least in our part of the world, that observation for the damage is likely directly related to that specific growth stage. So whenever we have these beans that are R5.5 to R6.5, and we get some weather event that comes through there, that seems to be that when we start creating the problem for the damage, and it just manifests the longer that that crop has to stay out there in that field. So quality issues, when does it happen? It's most often tied to these specific growth stages, and I think it's tied to weather more so than it is anything. For us, we do have occasional years where we get some red-banded stink bugs that come in, and that particular insect can cause a lot of damage issues as well. So I'd say that issue and then the weather are the two greatest ones for us to try to manage some of these quality. So that's the bulk of my slides. I just wanted to share a few more thoughts, I guess, with you. So when I think about like this green stem thing, y'all deal with green stem? So I didn't put the data in here mainly, and I wanted to leave plenty of time to have any kind of questions. I like to have questions back and forth with the audience anytime y'all want to. But this green stem thing, so I think there's different levels, at least that we've dealt with. There's a genetic green stem, so some varieties are naturally going to be a little harder to dry down than others. They're going to want to stay green longer. That's just somewhere in that genetic line. So that is not a huge issue. I think sometimes we blame it on that, but it's not a huge issue. In other words, I think that when a seed company notices that's a problem, that variety doesn't last long. It's not on the shelf for very long, and it gets pulled. So there's the genetic component of it. There's a certain weather component to it, and that's kind of the phenomenon that I described to you earlier, where we get some variability after emergence or at emergence, and that kind of causes that. So what that looks like, you know, to me, the genetic one, the whole field's green. You got green plants and dried down pods, and that's a mess. So when I have found that situation, I've taken all these products, and I have thrown everything in the kitchen sink at it. And when you get this true genetic green stem, I can't kill it, y'all. I know that's bad news, so if you ever encounter that, it's hard to kill it. I've sprayed these things, I've waited 2.5 weeks, and then you might start seeing a little bit of activity. It helps, but it's not going to terminate that thing all the way down to the dry level that you want to be able to go through efficiently. So, you know, the resulting situation in that scenario is slowing the combine down and having to feed through the best that you can. All these other situations of general greenness, whether it be a plant here and there or patches in the field, however that may come up, these harvest days are very effective at drying that down, and it all hinges back to that level of how green it was when you sprayed it. So if we went out into a field that was a day or two past R6.5, very green, and we sprayed a harvest date on that, it's probably going to take 10 days to 2 weeks before you really should put the combine into it, because that plant itself is still losing a lot of that greenness. The seed will go ahead and start drying down pretty good. The leaves, of course, will be gone, but the plant itself, the stems and so forth, will still stay green. If you're later than that, it doesn't take long at all for these products to do what you're trying to get done. So that's the main highlights, I think, of our experiences with it. Anybody, what questions do y'all have? Anything that I can answer or talk about?
You mentioned spraying too early. What's the latest you can spray that's still worth doing?
So the latest that you can spray and it's still worth doing, you know, I think you can answer that better than I can, because you know your field and how fast it's going to do it. But to me, let me back up and give you a scenario and see if that helps. So I was talking about the hurricanes brewing in the Gulf of Mexico coming our way. So the thing that goes through my mind is, if I've got a soybean field that, I mean, y'all know what my phone does when we get that. It's, what do you think? Should we spray this? Should we not spray it? To spray or not to spray, that's a hard question to answer, right? So when we get those scenarios, if I've got a field that's probably R6.5, moving on past that, I'm pretty comfortable spraying that, because chances are that once we, let me back up. Don't spray that one. The other one's the one I'm thinking about. So don't spray the one that's already at R6.5, because chances are by the time we get in the field, it will have already kind of started senescing. I could argue it either way. All right. So the other way that I would look at that is, if I've got an R6.2, 6.3, and the hurricane's a few days away, and I might could get that application out at R6.5 or a little bit later before that hurricane gets in, I probably would go ahead and spray that one, because it's going to take some time for it to dry down. So if I came back after a hurricane and we were 80%, you know, 60, 80% leaves starting to turn, I think it would just depend on my personal preference would be where my machine is on my operation. If I need to feed through that field and get it, you know, the harvest logistics, in other words. I don't think it's necessary if they're drying down naturally, but if it's something that could facilitate a better harvest, I think it's worth considering. that answer your question? Other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm an ag consultant. I work with several of the farmers in here, and we've been desiccating for probably the past 7 or 8 years. And a group of other fellows and myself, consultants, we did some work with the North Carolina soybean producers. I mentioned this to Jeff this morning. It's been a while back, but we compared paraquat and sharpen in 4 different regions of the state. And we happened to have a hurricane that year. And what we saw was the sharpen, we had less damage to beans in the pods at that point. But I mean, the harvestability with the paraquat is a lot quicker. And that's where we still are. Of course, you have to spray methylated seed oil with the sharpen. Have you seen any greater advantage in certain circumstances to use sharpen?
No, thanks for sharing that with me. That's a real similar observation that I've had. I've had some years where sharpen worked in probably 4 or 5 days, and I've had other years where 10 or 12 days is more like what it really took at the end of the day, and that can be a disappointment when it comes down to it. I think the biggest limitation that our growers have shared with me on using the sharpen is the cost of the whole application with the premium adjuvant system and everything. You know, as far as the harvestability and the damage, I don't think that I've ever observed necessarily, and it may not just be I haven't had the opportunity to see as many side by side in the extreme damage scenario to see the difference. But usually for us, whenever we have damage, it's just damage regardless of what's been done.
So the best thing to do is just look ahead, and hopefully, you know, you're not having storms. You got a good clear window for 10 days maybe. Spray it, harvest it, and get it out.
Yeah, take weather out of the equation. If I was drawing up a playbook, I would spray ever how many acres my machines could keep up with. Harvest and spray, harvest and spray. I wouldn't spray everything at once. I think you do increase potential for shattering. I showed that graph a while ago of the harvest delay and the yield loss. I think the yield loss from that scenario was from shattering. I didn't show the shattering data, but we did collect it, and we did have substantial shattering at 4 and 6 weeks. So, you know, that question comes up sometimes about how much do I increase my level of shattering. In a normal scenario where we're going to spray and we're probably going to put a machine in there sometime 2 or 2.5 weeks later at most, I don't think shattering is that big of a deal. It may be variety specific or environmental condition specific, but big picture wise, I don't think shattering is a great worry unless you're really delayed.
Question. On green skin.
Okay.
I know you talked about genetic, so take that off the board. When I walk in a field sometimes and walk through a lot of the green skin and patches around the field, if I stop and look at the beans very long, I start to notice that the green beans don't have nearly the pod load or bean load that other parts of the field might have. In other words, it's almost like in some cases there's no pods there, or maybe pods with 1 bean instead of 3 or 4. It's an observation, and I wonder, is that stress, early season, or some kind of stress that's reduced the pod load that causes the plant to then not have anywhere for that assembly to go, so it stays winter longer. Do y'all see that in your area?
Yeah, if you, so the most basic example I'm gonna think of, so last year, I wish I'd put this picture in this presentation, y'all be amazed by this. We had substantial hail. So we deal with hail, I mean, everybody deals with hail at some point, right? The whole time I've been around farming, we've always dealt with hail in April and May when the plants are this big, and you can go out there and replant if you have to. We had hailstorms in June this year. We had R1 to R4 soybeans that got pounded by softball size hail.
Did you show that in Mississippi?
I did. I showed that in my presentation. So you saw, you know, that particular situation. So that's an extreme example, but even in the lighter cases of that hail, that something happened to that plant. So I agree with what you're saying. I think that it's possible that something happened in those zones that just made it shed or be delayed. But anytime something like that happens, in my experience, you're going to have some kind of delay. And I think that's where you get a lot of that variability. Do y'all get a lot of variability? Like when you have a field that you don't spray and it starts to dry down naturally, is it kind of streaky, for lack of a better way to put it? Yeah. It's kind of become a common picture for us, and I think that's, I mean, it may be the way that we've, gone to these earlier varieties and putting them in our particular latitudes.
As a follow-up to that, have you ever seen a situation like that where you felt like maybe it was insect related?
Yeah, as far as greenness, yeah, the worst culprit is the red-banded stink bug for us. I mean, it's going to be green. It's going to stay green. It's going to be nasty.
Our kind of models tell us that we don't have anything like that.
Yeah, we don't get it every year. Your normal stink bug complex, will cause some damage and may cause some greenness, but it is nothing compared to what the red-banded stink bug will do. If it's left untreated, you wouldn't know it unless you got to the field, went out of the truck and looked.
Not always, but a lot of times when I talk to a grower that is experiencing green stem, and I compare them to the guys that don't tend to have much at all, I get trouble for saying this, but a lot of times the guys that have a lot of trouble that either didn't spray for stink bugs or sprayed once and never looked at the field again, never went in the field after in July or something, and the ones that don't seem to have so much problem are the ones that are a little bit more aggressive with stink bug control. Mm-hmm. I believe it just seems like that's a common thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a direct relation, some of that greenness.
And it wouldn't take much. I guess my point is sometimes, I think this might be a message, it doesn't take much to cause something. And I think that might be one of the things that folks are expecting. We're waiting for more damage or more, maybe a greater number of them, but the guys that are more aggressive seem to knock it out.
You see any different quality wise between the Virgo brown bean versus the gray bean?
That's a good question. So I mentioned my dad, farmed, his whole life, still helps my brother. He's made the same comment to me. When I was a kid, he said, "I hate these gray beans." Right. He said, "I hate these gray beans. I only want to grow these red beans." So, yes, I have seen that same phenomenon, that a gray colored bean does not seem to weather as well as a red one. However, when you really throw it out there and you have that scenario line up where you're going to get that damage, it doesn't matter what color it is. These modern soybean varieties just they can't weather like they could maybe 30 years ago. I've had guys tell me that we used to leave beans in the field till January, wait for the ground to freeze if it would, and cut them. Why can't we do that anymore? And we can't. We also used to cut 15 bushels, and we don't do that anymore either. So, so I don't know. I think that when it comes down to the damage factor, it's environmental. It's just simply environmental. And ways to mitigate it, all I can say is that's where I see the value of what we've been talking about this morning at its greatest. Sure, I think it's valuable to speed everything up. You want to make your harvest operations flow how it needs to flow. It's good to have the efficiency of your machine in your field. But when you're talking about risks of quality and that weathering, get them out. Get them out fast.
This may be a really dumb question, and I apologize for this, but when you're desiccating beans, are the moisture in the actual bean dropping quickly as well, or is that dry?
Yeah, no, nobody's drying any soybeans, so it falls with it. And that's part of what goes into that equation of how long it takes for you to put that machine in, to your question earlier. Like if there's that much green, you're going to meet that pre-harvest interval pretty easily, because it takes time to. I call them butter beans. It takes time for those butter beans to dry down. Another question? Well, again, thank y'all for the opportunity to be here. If anything, any kind of questions I can answer, I'm glad to. I hate to run out the door before the program's over, but I do have to travel this afternoon, so
You'll stay long as
I'm gonna stay for a little while. So y'all holler at me if you have any questions.